Well, I'm not really here to rain on your parade. And what I can say is it was with surprise and delight that I received the invitation from Darryl to speak at an AHA conference, believing mistakenly that it was the Australian Hoteliers Association. However, I was still surprised and delighted when I found out it was this one. So, just make sure I've got the buttons right. What I'm going to talk to you about are not the general threats to our ability to use old cars, which include things like autonomous driverless cars coming. You know, eventually, I think we have to face the fact that we won't be allowed to drive, but hopefully it's a long way off. You know, the push for zero emissions and so on. And one day it'll be almost impossible to insure our cars, I suspect, unless we have a good, strong, vibrant movement that is able to defend our interests. And whilst there are lots of very well-intentioned people out there all doing their bit, we need to be more coordinated and so on. The less obvious but more pressing threats for us in Australia, in the old car movement, are all derive in one way or another from federal legislation, which prevents the importation or re-importation of old cars. And they are the luxury car tax, the asbestos in second-hand car imports, and the loss of the automatic entitlement to import an old car. Why is this important? A bit of background. Australia had the highest standard of living in the 20th century, virtually of every country in the world. And it meant that many of the world's great cars came here new or soon after they were made. In 1930, we were fifth in the world in terms of car ownership, not per capita, but number of total cars on the road. 570,000, only behind the USA, UK, Germany and France. And this just indicates why we had a historic vehicle fleet that was the envy of the rest of the world. And then after World War II, lots of wonderful cars came in because Australia was booming, with wool being a pound and so on. And our fleet, as I say, was the envy of the rest of the world. And up until 2000, it was possible to bring cars in just as easily as it was to export them. In the 70s, there was a worldwide recognition of the value of the old car movement, and from then on, most countries removed customs duty on the importation of old cars, and those active in the area know that that exemption for vehicles more than 30 years old continues to this day. And other countries like the UK, who had a consumption tax, it's currently 20%, normally 5% for old cars. And we even had a car enthusiast in the lodge at the time, Malcolm Fraser, with his Lancias. This then brings me to the luxury car tax. And those of you who are admirers of Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland, will be delighted to know that despite him having passed on, his spirit lives on in the Commonwealth Legislative Draftsman's Office. And in particular, when Humpty said, "When I use a word, it means just what I would choose it to mean, neither more nor less." And the particular word that they decided to seize on to give it a very special meaning was luxury. This is luxury. Essentially, a horse-drawn vehicle where they didn't tick the horse option, but ticked effectively the lawnmower engine option. And despite having no windscreen, doors, roof, steering wheel, or any of the other things that we take for granted, it is a luxury car. It has one concession to luxury, a bit ahead of its time. It was equipped so you could have heated rear seats. Just add a match, because that's the petrol tank. Now, counterintuitively, what you're about to see is not a luxury car. That is not a luxury car, and it's all about the price. You remember the old Rolls-Royce saying about quality being remembered long after the price is forgotten? Well, unfortunately, the luxury car tax means you'll remember the price forever. From 1986 to 2000, there was a form of luxury car tax. You may remember in the 80s, there was a limit placed on the amount you could depreciate your car from. So if you bought a new car, the maximum depreciation limit was pitched at just above the price of a Holden Statesman or a Ford Fairlane. And that was brought in at the request of the Australian car manufacturers to make overseas cars more expensive. And then in 1986, I think when Hawke got in, he added it, put a special surplus wholesale sales tax on cars worth more than that depreciation limit threshold. So there was a form of luxury car tax, but the key thing to note is it only applied to new cars. And then in the late 90s, you'll remember the GST came along to replace all the indirect taxes we had in Australia, and in particular wholesale sales tax. At that time, the wholesale sales tax on luxury cars was 45%, and the GST replaced that with 10%, and of course the value of new cars was going to drop. That was regarded as an evil, yet again, perverse reasoning. And so they introduced the Luxury Car Tax Act to apply a 25% tax on the value of the car above the threshold. By sleight of hand, with never an explanation, it was also made to apply both the GST and the LCT to imported second-hand cars. They mostly affect those in the old car movement because, as you know, the automatic entitlement to import an old car only applies to cars made before 1989, so cars more than 30 years old, give or take a year. And of course, the word luxury was used, only the us and them, the rich can afford the luxury and all that sort of thing. And the anomaly was that an identical old car bought within Australia privately was not subject to GST or the luxury car tax. And if you bought one from a dealer, yes, you had to pay GST, but again, no luxury car tax. So a big anomaly that was identified long ago. It's not based on the purchase price solely. It's based on what's called the luxury car tax value, yet another bit of legislative draftsman having fun. The threshold at the moment is a bit over $66,000, and the LCT value is not only what you pay for your car at auction in Europe, you have to add to that the freight to get it to Australia and the insurance and the GST. And then if it goes over the threshold, you pay luxury car tax on the amount over the threshold. It's not a big deal if you're buying a $60,000 or $70,000 car. But on higher value cars, and without naming anyone, a certain Bugatti was sold that had been in long-term Australian ownership at the Bonhams auction in Monaco in May 2016, 1.1 million euros. About 1.6 Australian, I think. And anyone who bought that car and wanted to bring it back in would have to pay about $600,000 in GST and luxury car tax. It's even more bizarre. The reason I got interested in this, I've got an old E-Type I've had for 32 years. A mate of mine who now lives in America got frustrated with my inactivity and said, send it over, I'll restore it for you. He loves restoring E-Types. And I was about to ship it away, and then someone said to me, watch out for the luxury car tax. I said, what do you mean? And it turns out that even though ownership doesn't change, if I send that car over to the United States, he restores it, and it's a Series 1 E-Type Roadster, say it's worth 200 grand when it comes back in, I get to pay GST and luxury car tax on my own car of about 60 grand. That's what made me prick up my ears. What's that? How does that work? I think the word you're looking for is unfairly. Anyway, and the other miracle is you can have a worn-out original car that's worth nothing, and then it becomes sought after by collectors, and then miraculously, by a purpose of transmogrification, while you're not looking, it becomes a luxury car when its value exceeds the threshold. So there's all this sort of nonsense going on. The problem was recognised quite early, and in 2008, when the Senate conducted an inquiry, as it does, into the proposal by the Rudd government to increase the luxury car tax rate from 25 to 33%, two car organisations, namely the AOMC in Victoria and the Sporting Car Club of South Australia, made submissions to the Senate and said, we think you should take it off cars more than 30 years old if you want to import them. And they identified the damage to the old car fleet that was occurring and so on. And John Burt, who was then the president of the Sporting Car Club of South Australia, gave oral testimony, and he said, you have to appreciate, it's not a lot of fun necessarily driving these cars. They're mongrels to drive, but we love them. Anyway, the committee divided along party lines, with the then Labor government virtually saying, why someone didn't think of increasing the rate from 25 to 33% earlier, we've no idea. It's the best thing we've ever heard of. And the LNP minority report said it's a terrible thing to do and it's just a tax grab. What they all agreed on was the desirability of exempting cars more than 30 years old from this, and urged the movement to make a submission to the Henry Tax Review. The movement didn't, and guess what? We've still got it. 10 years on, all the predictions about the damage and loss to the historic car fleet remain. Fast forward to last year, and I wrote a little article in the Vintage Car Club magazine about the luxury car tax and how idiotic it was. There'd been a group of people meeting in Melbourne regularly, agreeing that something needed to be done about the luxury car tax. They invited me to join them, and I must have left the room or something, because I then ended up as the chairman of the group.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. And we decided that more wailing and gnashing of teeth wasn't likely to achieve anything more than it had over the last 20 years, so we embarked on a fact-finding mission to put together a proper pre-budget submission. So we surveyed car club members, we tapped into local knowledge of people with particular knowledge of particular marques, lots of inquiries of the Commonwealth, FOI applications and so on, to get a factual basis on which to make a submission. And we compared Australia with the sort of import barriers to bringing old cars into every other country and so on. And here are some of the takeouts from that research. Australia has the highest barriers to entry of any country in the old car world. Second is New Zealand with 15%. Bear in mind that for us, once you go over 100 grand, it's 40% or more, the total tax burden to bring in a car. Countries like the UK, as I mentioned before, actually lower their consumption tax for bringing in old cars, because they recognise what a terrific thing it is for the economy. In 1617, the value to the UK economy of the old car movement was £5.5 billion. In Australia, the predictions about the luxury car tax being a one-way valve were proven correct. We've lost many of our wonderful cars, and one example is the Vauxhall 3098. We had 40% of the world's survivors in 2000, 74 out of 187. We've lost 30 cars overseas since, and we now have 23%, and none have come back. And there's another one on the market at the moment that is probably also going to go overseas. Same story with vintage Bentleys. You name it, the story is the same. Now, Treasury, who administer this, from time to time they publish things, and one of the mantras of them is, a good tax is one that doesn't unduly distort a consumption decision. In other words, the fact the tax is there doesn't make you decide not to do something. It's got to be pitched at a level. It is such an effective barrier in this case that the average amount raised on cars more than 30 years old per year, and almost the same in any year, is $1.2 million. That is, for the last financial year, less than 0.25% of the luxury car tax raised comes from cars more than 30 years old. We found there is an exemption that was first sought in 2011 and finally became law in 2017 for museums to bring in a car free of GST and luxury car tax, provided the car is going to be displayed only and not used on the road. Which sort of defeats the purpose of the exercise if you believe old cars ought to be driven. And when you think of the benefits that flow everywhere if the cars are actually out and about rather than being confined to being a stationary exhibit. Another thing we did was surveyed club members around Australia. The survey went to 1,000 members in multiple clubs, and about 400 responded. And those 400 own 676 cars overseas that, would import 676 historic cars were it not for the luxury car tax. Here and overseas, they have spent on their cars that they own that are worth more than the threshold, $24,000 per car over the last 5 years, or a total of $21 million. The average amount spent per car per year has been $4,800, or 7 times the amount spent on newer cars. If the luxury car tax didn't exist and they came in, all that money would be spent in the Australian economy. We also found that were they imported, the government in that first year alone would earn $4.3 million in GST, which would more than offset the luxury car tax of 1.2 that they would forego. In 5 years, if the work on those cars continued at the same expenditure rate, they would get GST of $1.6 million from those cars alone, the work done on them, and it would actually be revenue positive, a message that appears to be very hard to sell. Some in the movement take the view that this is just elitist nonsense. One view put by someone who should know better to me was, he said, I think this luxury car tax on old cars coming in is a great idea. And I said, why is that? He said, those rich bastards who made money sending them overseas ought to pay to have to bring them back. And that's from someone in a national motoring organisation. And here's the other thing, rich boys' toys give poor boys jobs. Wolf Grod, whom many of you will know, of Sleeping Beauties in Brisbane, gave me a list of 10 cars that clients of his want to import and have him restore and keep the cars here. One of those cars is a rather notorious Mercedes from before the war, for sale in derelict state for 1.3 million US. The customer wants to buy it and bring it in, and Wolf said he's accepted that it would cost $1 million Australian to restore. He can't bring it in because he's going to have to cough up $700,000 in tax and isn't prepared to do so. Generally, people who've got that sort of money to buy cars didn't get it by throwing money away like that, given that the car will still only be worth what he paid for it after he's coughed up the $700,000 to get it in. And as Wolf said, if that came in, that would give me 4 employees full-time work for 3 years. Great old cars are tourist attractions in their own right. Just imagine if we had the Beast of Turin here still, you know, that Fiat, that wonderful 28-litre Fiat that was once an Australian car. It draws crowds wherever it goes in Europe. Historic car event tourism, and even though we may not all be able to own these wonderful cars, if they're here, we will come and look at them. People will come and look at them. And you just have to look at the boom in interest around the world. It is almost impossible to comprehend the size of some of these events. Hershey in America covers 85 acres, has 700 volunteer staffers, and in 2017, 250,000 people came along. Technoclassica Essen in Germany covers 30 acres, and last year they got 185,000 visitors from 41 countries. There's Goodwood and so on. Australia really only has Motorclassica, and we're really missing out on what could be a great economic activity in Australia. Further evidence of the interest is the way the manufacturers of cars, racing cars from the 50s and 60s, who are still in existence, are cashing in on the nostalgia craze by making these continuation cars. They made, I think, 20 brand new Aston Martin DB4 GTs, all sold before the ink was dry for £1.5 million. The XKSS and lightweight E-types of Jaguar all sold. They made a continuation series of 16 of one of them and 10 of the other, I think. All sold for £1 million. You can't ever register them or put them on the road anywhere, but people want them. One of the XKSSs went to New Zealand. Jaguar wanted to get one into the Southern Hemisphere. Australia couldn't because it would have to pay the luxury car tax on it. So it went to New Zealand instead and is drawing crowds as it is taken around New Zealand for people to have a look at. If you look in the magazines like Octane, there's 2 things you'll notice. One is the number of new businesses specialising in old cars that have cropped up over the last 20 years. And the other is the fact that the Australian advertisements are generally from dealers selling our cars overseas. No problem with that, provided we can bring them back in or bring in similar cars. We're losing skills and expertise and knowledge, whereas they're having new apprentice courses in the UK to teach people how to look after these cars. There's also cultural heritage issues. You'd be aware of the Protection of Movable Cultural Heritage Act 1986, the intention of which is to prevent the export of cars of particular cultural significance to Australia. Not only cars, but bikes and any other movable artefacts. the objective of this legislation, part of which is to see the repatriation of cultural artefacts that have left Australia, is subverted by the luxury car tax. And I'll show you why with a very clear comparison. You may be aware of the Vincent Black Lightning motorbike that Jack Eretz raced, held the Australian land speed record for motorbikes and so on. It left not that long ago, may or may not have been in contravention of the PMCH Act, but an Australian from Tasmania who owns Huon fish farms or something, paid a world record price for a motorbike in Las Vegas in December last year, $929,000 US. He's spitting chips over the fact he has to pay over $100,000 in GST to bring it home, but he can because he's prepared to actually pay the GST. On the other hand, one of the Gordon Edgell family, you know Edgell's canned foods, one of the sons, who was active in the business, bought an Aston Martin DB5 in 1965, owned by a mate of mine for 20 years, Brian McMillan, in Brisbane. It went overseas in 95, not from Brian's hands, but someone else. In late 17, an Australian bought that car in London. He wanted to bring it back because he thought it would be a great thing to return to Australia. Then he discovered the luxury car tax and GST, and he's not prepared to cough the 400 grand to bring the car home, so it's staying in London. And when I put this to the minister who looks after cultural heritage items and how important it is that we can repatriate things, his response was, if you know of any cars that have gone overseas in contravention of the Act, please dob them in so we can forcibly repatriate them. In other words, I'll confiscate them overseas and bring them back. Okay, are there any downsides to having more old cars on the road? As it happens, old cars are safer than new cars. At least that's what the stats say. The UK government, as you may know, encourages old car use and give you free road tax and all this sort of thing. They also have an annual roadworthy inspection, which is called the MOT, short for Ministry of Transport. They are exempting cars more than 30 years old, more than 40 years old from it. The reason being the MOT failure rate and the number of people killed and seriously injured in accidents involving these cars are lower per mile driven than they are for newer cars. Cars between 30 and 40 years old, same accident rate as newer cars. And so they've exempted every car over 40 years of age from the MOT test. There's also fewer harmful pollutants that you get out of the diesels and things that are running around today. And I can tell you they're driven shorter distances for a range of reasons. In the Queensland summer, there's 6 months of the year you really don't want to take an open car out in daylight. It's just too hot or too wet. And of course, a lot of older cars are on historic rego, which restricts their use anyway. So there's a whole range of reasons why they are not harmful. There's lots of upsides: regional businesses, jobs, skills. Old cars are sort of fundamental to the men's shed movement. All the sort of reasons that they're important, old cars are important too. I won't run through all the things, but I'll tell you what we did. We lodged a pre-budget submission that highlighted all these facts that I've just mentioned. We've got mixed responses, but we're building a support base within Parliament. People who like instant gratification, I say to them, remember the advice given to the oyster on one of those wonderful British TV talk shows where you have very witty people. And in this particular case, the person was given 5 seconds to come up with what advice you would give to an oyster on a plate, an open oyster on a plate. And the answer was, try not to get your hopes up. But bear in mind that it took from 2011 when Treasurer Swan announced the exemption for museums to February 2017 for it to become law. So this stuff moves slowly. We've just got to play the long game. I've spoken to people in Treasury, and I don't want this quoted, and these aren't their words, but they're mine. It's very hard to get luxury car tax altered. It's regarded as both a sacred cow and a milking cow, which is a fatal combination if you want it changed. But they're happy to sort of help push it along if there's moves to reform other aspects of the luxury car tax. That now brings me to the asbestos issue. And as you know, you'll all be aware of the 6 Maseratis that came in to do that rally, the first global gathering of Maseratis, that were asbestos free. They got here. Border Force weren't prepared to accept that they were asbestos free despite what appeared to be appropriate documentation. And as you probably know, when Border Force decide a car's got to be tested, they don't do it themselves, but they get other people to do things like cut wiring out of original wiring looms, cut headlining out, drill holes into double firewalls to see if there's any asbestos in there, and generally destroy the originality of an original car or the perfection of a restoration on a restored car. And Border Force, you would have seen their videos, unfortunately I suspect, where they talk about finding lethal and deadly asbestos in classic cars, and they're driven by a desire to protect the community, with public safety being their main driver. And they found 60 old cars coming in last year with it in it. There's a fair bit of hypocrisy about this because everyone knows old cars have got asbestos in them. Everyone also knows, who knows anything about them, that unless it's disturbed and floating around, it represents no harm to health. And they knew it from 2003 onwards as well. Because up until the end of 2003, every car in Australia could legally be sold with asbestos in it. I'll come back to that in a minute. The question is, are they justified in doing what they're doing? And is the cost to the Australian taxpayer justified? A bit of background on asbestos. For it to hurt you, you've got to breathe it in, unless you're using it in talcum powder, which is a separate issue. They've got to be respirable fibres. All of us have been exposed to asbestos. There's a low background level that occurs naturally, and it also occurs near higher levels near naturally occurring deposits of it and so on. And it used to be near the mines and the factories where it was extracted and processed. If it's bound into a matrix like fibro-cement housing components or gaskets, it represents no risk whatsoever because it's bound, it isn't what they call friable, it can't fly around and be breathed in. The real danger these days is not from cars, but from building demolition, factory fires and things like that. The Mr. Fluffy insulation scandal in Canberra, you'd remember that, presumably. And it is a big problem in Australia because Australia had the highest usage of it per capita in the world. We had mines here. Every capital city had a processing plant where it was put into end-use products. And today, even now on the most conservative estimates, 1 in 3 houses in Australia contains asbestos. As I say, if it's not disturbed, it represents no harm, no hazard. Then there have been 3 waves of sufferers. Mechanics not among them, although some mechanics have got mesothelioma. But the waves of sufferers, the first wave was those involved in the mining of it and the incorporation of it into end-use products, so factories where they were putting it into brake linings and so on. It was flying around in the air there, people breathed it in. So the first wave of sufferers was that lot of people. The second lot was those who installed the end-use products and had to cut them to fit and so on. And the third wave is from the DIY home renovators from 20 and 30 years ago who are getting an extra boost now with all these home renovation programs on TV and people getting stuck into their fibro with circular saws and so on. And there are the bystander cases. They're the families of people who came home with asbestos in their overalls and so on, breathed it in and got ill. And there's been lots of publicity about it. You all remember Bernie Banton, who I think it's fair to say shirt-fronted Tony Abbott before Tony Abbott shirt-fronted Putin, if you remember. The CSR Wittenoom mine, where they mine blue asbestos, which is the really nasty stuff. The stuff that's in brake pads and things is white asbestos, which is still nasty stuff, but not regarded as lethal as the white and brown asbestos forms. Up to the end of 2003, at the end of 2003, Australia banned the importation and use of asbestos in any product, but it was, as I said before, legal to be included in car components up until then. A number of manufacturers stopped using it in the late 80s and early 90s, but it was common practice when you were replacing brake pads and things to put asbestos pads in. So cars that came out with it with none in it ended up with asbestos in them because the superior physical characteristics for braking and wear on discs and so on. The Australian Bureau of Statistics tell us that there's 18 million vehicles on the road today in Australia, registered and running. Half of them were made before 2004. Now we reckon probably 2/3 of the pre-2004 cars have still got asbestos in them. And unless a classic made more than 30 years old has had a full nut and bolt restoration, it'll have asbestos in it. So why have the ABF, who turned a blind eye for 13 years, suddenly set out to demonise old cars and trumpet their successes in finding asbestos in them when they come in? There's a bit of history, and I'm not saying this is why they are now doing it, but the history is this. They missed lots of stuff coming in. They missed all those building products that most notoriously ended up in the Perth Children's Hospital, stuff that came in from China this decade. They missed the stuff that ended up in Queensland's new Tower of Power, the executive building for the parliamentarians. They missed the 25,000 Geely, Great Wall and Cherry vehicles that came in from China in 2012, all of which had asbestos in the gaskets. It's instructive to look at how the ACCC dealt with this. And the ACCC, I have to say, is the one voice of reason in a fragmented set of policies coming out of the Commonwealth. The ACCC regards as its mantra, avoiding consumer detriment. It could have ordered a recall of all those cars and compelled the replacement of every gasket in them, but it didn't. The only recall it ordered was that they come in and have a label put on them saying this car could contain asbestos. And the reason for that was there were two different lots of expert opinion provided to the ACCC. All said there's negligible risk to driver, passenger and mechanic unless the gaskets are abraded. Otherwise you can't even measure the asbestos in the air around them when you pull them apart. So the ACCC said it is well known in automotive workshops that cars made before 2004 might have asbestos in them, so they adopt procedures that are published on all the state government websites as to how workshops deal with asbestos. And there's a really simple, cheap way that even the DIY home mechanic can use. So in 2016, Minister Dutton ordered a review of, yes? Five, yeah, I'm nearly there, nearly done. Ordered a review of the way Border Force had been handling asbestos, and they said a fair bit's been getting through. As soon as that was published, the unions and the Queensland Labor government leapt onto it and used Border Force as a blunt instrument to beat up Minister Dutton and the federal government. And this is my take only on it, but I think the ABF, smarting from this, decided they needed to get some good stats up. And classic cars are an easy, soft target. Gaskets are no risk. I'll have to cut it a bit short here, but is brake dust a risk from cars braking near intersections? Answer, no. Surveys conducted when every car had it in it near intersections still found almost very, very low levels of asbestos, including, for example, on the Tullamarine Freeway exit in 1976 and in London in 1990, one of the heaviest use intersections, very low levels. And there's a wet method that can be used. I won't go into what that means because I'm running out of time, but you can do that at home. Basically, don't blow out the brake drum with the air hose. Spray it down with water, wipe with a wet rag and so on. So there's no risk to anyone, properly managed. And the problem is the ABF is fully entitled to be enforcing this zero tolerance ban because it's the law. And there's no point in seeking a ministerial exemption either, because the minister has no power to exempt white asbestos imports from the ban. What needs to change is the law, which are the regulations under the Customs Act, and the only way you can change those is by getting both Houses of Parliament to agree, and with the hysteria around asbestos at the moment, it is unlikely they will do so without a proper and lengthy campaign to bring us into line with the rest of the world. And lastly, I mentioned before, at the moment, the Minister has no discretion to refuse an application to import a pre-1989 car. It says the Minister must grant the vehicle import approval. There's new provisions coming, changing the 89 date to a rolling 25 year. What they don't tell you in all the self-promoting blurbs is that it's no longer an automatic right. It's subject to the minister's discretion. So you buy your car at auction in London, try to bring it in, and he, in his discretion, refuses to allow it. And he can require the car to be inspected at your expense anywhere in the world to help him make up his mind. I'll just jump forward. What we really need is a more powerful national old car lobby movement. The AHMF is the obvious vehicle for that, but there's a bit of work needed to get them to really engage properly, I think, on some of these issues. I don't want to criticise them, but I think more could be done, partly because of what they do or don't do. This group's come into existence that I chair. And not only do we need something like the UK's federation, but we should be encouraging federal parliamentarians to form bodies like they have in other countries. In England, for example, they have the All-Parliamentary Historic Vehicles Group, and most of them are Knights of the Realm. You know, the tentacles of the old car movement go right to the top in the UK. Anyway, that brings my presentation to an end. Thank you for listening. All done.